So Tacitus writes in the Germania, he declares that the Anglo-Saxons, or Germanic people, are the superior race of people. And he says they have superior organization, they have superior politics, um, they have superior structure, they have superior government, and and he makes an assertion that everybody should seek to be like the Anglo-Saxons. Now, it doesn't take much to realize that part of being part of an Anglo-Saxon uh, racial identity, one requires that you have white skin. And so there really were certain people who could not ever become like the Anglo-Saxons, and that would be people of African descent and other groups of people of color who are very clearly not presenting in the world with white skin or European characteristics. And so that becomes important because while we tell the story of the creation of America and we talk about how it started sort of with, religion, um, the heathens and the Christians, while that is true that the explorers who came over to the new lands felt that they were, um, you know, creating this new world for God, but they also did not come over with a blank slate. They also came over quite influenced by Tacitus's writings in the Germania in terms of who they thought were superior groups of people and who were not superior groups of people. And so it is one, uh, and so we know kind of in my own, Catholic uh, history, um, we also have the doctrines of discovery, right? That came from the papal bulls, which said that if any lands were occupied by non-Christians, they could be taken. It established this kind of spiritual, political, and legal justification for colonization and seizure of lands that were not inhabited by Christians. And so our Christian sort of heathen history is also a history about racial superiority, right? An explorer could claim to discover land already occupied in the name of Christian Europe monarchy and simply plant their flag in the name of cultural superiority and divine design. Two papal bulls stand out for me around that, and that's the one in 1455 by Pope Nicholas that granted the Portuguese a monopoly of trade with Africa and authorized the enslavement of local people. And then there's the papal bull of 1493 by Pope Alexander VI, who justified Christian European claims to waterways that allegedly discovered and promoted Christian domination and superiority. So these ideas of superiority, inferiority were already kind of breathing life. And then you kind of have this, of course, the doctrine of discovery, right, which was the inspiration in the 1800s for the Monroe Doctrine, declaring U.S. hegemony over the Western Hemisphere and manifest destiny, which justified American westward expansion, propagating the belief that the U.S. was destined to control all lands from the Atlantic to the Pacific and beyond. And in fact, even in 1823, there's a Supreme Court case, Johnson versus McIntosh, that became part of U.S. federal law and was used to dispossess Native peoples of their land. So, why does this history matter? It matters because it's important for us to understand that a story of race was created in the US, connected to that history that informs our lives today as Catholic Christians and people of faith. And much of European history was stacked to create a story and a justification for racial inferiority for people of color. And it makes sense that when the creation of the New Worlds, now known as America, was being constructed, that just about every institution and system was legally and intentionally designed to serve white people exclusively and those connected to European history. So just about every system, our policing system, our education systems, our financial systems, our housing systems, our religious systems, our employment systems, our healthcare systems, our transportation systems, our political government systems, and our cultural arts systems. We have to keep asking the question, who did they have in mind when these systems were being created? And so, even in our country, we filled America's top shelf priority with the agendas and the preferences of those who were white, who held social, economic, and political power. at its onset, and we baked those things into the systems from the vantage point of white, wealthy, land owning men. And here's part of the result of some of that, right? Is that my ancestors, people of African descent, many of them were brought here in chains with that thinking, that philosophy in mind about who should be on the top and who should be on the bottom. And so I think that's really important to hold at um, as I talk about my own personal journey to the priesthood and to the work of racial justice. So here's my story. So my family came here from Forest City, Arkansas, and they came here to escape kind of the unequal opportunity and racist conditions of the South that's connected to that history of Black enslavement. And so my parents and many in my family grew up in an environment where they were um, the only goal that society had for them is that they get educated up to the fourth grade, which was the education of both of my parents. Black people during the time that they were growing up were expected to just learn enough to read and write because they were thought to belong in the fields, building white wealth. And so both of my parents had a fourth grade education. My uncle said that they would often choose to keep recycling the fourth grade just to keep their minds sharp and because they were thought to spend their lives working in fields, picking cotton and potatoes and tomatoes and whatever else was planted that needed to go to market to hold up the economic system. And so they would often endure the daily indignities, along with my grandparents, of kind of whites only and colored only signs for schools and hospitals and churches and drinking fountains and swimming pools and parks and restaurants, and they were constantly being cheated and paid unequally for the labor and the work that they did. My grandmother shared a story with me that she told me that once she said she would work quite regularly in the fields and pick cotton, and she said I'd pick 400 pounds of cotton a day, and at the end of the week she said I would only be paid $4. And the prevailing wage, as we looked it up, for that much cotton really should have earned her $20 that week. But because she was Black and intentionally uneducated and not in control of the systems, she was dependent to survive on what she was given and subsequently cheated of $16 an hour every week. Eventually, my father had kind of had it with the inequities of the South, and he decided to try to get his family out of there. There was a practice that there was a bus that would come once a year to the South to pick up these Southern workers and take them up north to apply their skills of working the fields on migrant farms of the North, like in Sodus, New York, and Albion, New York. The bus quickly filled up this particular year, and my father went on the bus to ask the bus driver if he would come back and pick up his family. And the bus driver said, "Nope, we do that once a year. I'm sorry." But my relatives tell me that my father had a talk with the bus driver. They don't know what he said, but it must have been quite powerful because the bus driver then came back. And that's how my family was able to load themselves up on this bus and come up north. And they finally ended up in Albion, New York, on a migrant farm called Bud Conley's camp. And it is in Albion that I was born, the youngest of 8 siblings. And so eventually my father would find that it might have been a little bit better, but it really kind of mirrored the inequities and the injustices that they fled the South for. And so he began to travel to Rochester to move us to find a better job and a better life for his family. And he was able to find work when I was 4 years old, and he moved us from Albion to Rochester. And so my family having that history um, and holding that history, and I think we all carry our histories in our bodies. Um, they were very deliberate in raising us in a way that shaped me for the work of social and racial justice. And really all of my siblings, they raised us to be justice minded, to care about fairness, to believe that we could be and do anything, to treat all people with care, and to challenge systems and practices that harmed people and kept them down. So first they taught us that gender didn't matter. Just because you were a boy didn't mean that you had an advantage over a girl. How did they teach us that? We all had to do the same chores. We had to cook. We all had to take the garbage out, right? We all had to do the dishes. We all had to help in the garden. We all had to learn how to fish. We had to do everything together. So they were very even-handed with me and my siblings. The other thing that my parents taught us was that um, to protect the vulnerable and to always honor elders. And so my mother and father would often say, never kick somebody when they are down. Always respect your elders. Welcome the stranger. Share what you have with people who have less. They knew how much they depended on other people's generosity because of where they had come from. They taught us to not be part of the problem, but be part of the solution. Always look to do the right thing. If you get into trouble, they would tell us doing the right thing, we will back you up. And so growing up, the community was an extension of family for us. My parents took in all kinds of strangers in our homes who were down on their luck. So they modeled these things for us. They didn't just tell us. We took in homeless people. We took in homeless children. We took in struggling teenagers. They never turned anyone hungry away. There was always enough food for one more. And they taught us the importance of experiencing Black joy and the joy of Black community, the joy of cultural connection, the joy of Black people supporting one another toward a common goal and working with anybody who wanted to do better. The third most important lesson I think my parents taught us was to always challenge injustice and practices that harm people. They modeled this lesson by standing up for me whenever they felt that injustice was coming for their own children. And I remember I was in the second grade, and it was probably one of the most powerful examples. In Rochester, paddling children was legal in the education system here. And so I had a teacher in the second grade who would not allow us as second graders to go to the bathroom. And so every day a child was wetting themselves. And the teacher would call you up to the front of the classroom and she would paddle you with this thick wooden paddle for wetting yourself. And of course, one day my turn came and I asked to go to the bathroom. She said no. And then when I wet myself, she paddled me. Well, I went home and I told my mother. And the very next day, my mother came to the school and with me, she walked me to school and she went into the principal's office and she said, I want to see Miss Jackson. And the principal said, well, what do you want with Miss Jackson? She said, well, yesterday she paddled my second grader, my daughter, because she wouldn't let her go to the bathroom. She said, and I'm going to paddle Miss Jackson and let her know what it feels like because she's a child. She has a child's bladder. And when a child has to go to the bathroom, she needs to let her go to the bathroom. And I don't care what the law says. It's wrong and I'm going to put a stop to it. My mother was furious. And so the principal did tell us where the room was, but somehow they sent somebody to get Miss Jackson out of there. And when we got to the room was empty. She was gone. She wasn't there. And she was never my teacher again. I don't know where they sent her. I don't know what they did with her. But my mother standing up um, got rid of this unjust practice of hitting children for not allowing them to go to the bathroom. Around the time I turned 16 years old, I joined the Black Catholic Church. Um, and I joined because they were neighbors who were members of a Black Catholic church called St. Bridget's, and they had a split in their church. Their priest left, half their church left, and they needed singers. My family was a musical family. We sang, and my father played guitar, my brother played bass, and my siblings sang. And so they asked us to come to the church to help them because they lost half of their choir. And that's how was my introduction into the Black Catholic Church. We thought we were going off to help them with music. And then I fell in love with the church and I fell in love with God and I fell in love with Jesus. And by the time I turned 24, both of my parents had died. My father when I was 15, my mother when I was 24. And I was left to kind of navigate the world with two small children and a nursing degree that I had obtained when I was 18. I was a licensed practical nurse, but it was probably around that time that I felt this really strong calling to serve God. And the only problem was that I was Black, I was a woman, and I was a Catholic. And women had a hard enough time leading um, in the Black church, but in the Catholic church, it was very clear that you could not be a priest because you were a female. And so girls were not allowed to be priests, according to the church. But I had watched God and heard stories in my family of God doing the impossible. And my family was kind of a witness of that impossibility. So when I turned 24, um, the priest asked me if I would preach my first sermon at St. Bridget's, it's Black Catholic Church. And I said, absolutely not. I certainly was spending much more time with God, but it never occurred to me that I'd be doing anything with the official institutional church. And so it was quite a shock to me that he'd asked me that. And I said no. And the priest said, well, don't say no. Go home, pray about it first, and then give me an answer. And so I did. I went home and I prayed about it, and I didn't hear God say anything to me. So I took that as a no. I was ready to tell the priest no the next time I saw him, the next Sunday. And then I was vacuuming and cleaning the house. And as I was cleaning, I felt a little tug, a pull in the um, middle of my shirt. And I looked down, and it was kind of a strange sensation, but I ignored it. I thought, this is kind of weird. Like, I don't know why my shirt got kind of taut all of a sudden. So I kept vacuuming, and then it happened again. And then I knew that God was calling me. So I went upstairs to my room. I dropped on my knees and I said, God, are you calling me? And God said, yes. I called you to preach and teach my word. And I was absolutely flabbergasted, just shocked. And I thought, you can't be calling me to do that. I'm Black, I'm a woman, and I'm Catholic, and they don't do that in my church. But there was silence. That's really all I heard God say to me. And so then I said, this is nuts. But then the Holy Spirit brought back a conversation that I'd had with my godmother um, shortly prior to this particular time. And I remembered a conversation where she said, honey, when heaven is silent, that means that God said it and that settles it. And I thought, oh, you've got to be kidding me, right? And so then I thought, fine, God, if this is what you're asking me to do, I'll do it. But I need you to do two things for me. I need you to enter a covenant with me. The first one is I need you to give me what I need to do what you're asking me to do because I don't know how to do it. I need you to help me. And the second thing I need you to do, God, is I need you to promise to open the doors for me so that I can step through them and meet you on the other side. And I said, God, I won't convince people that you've called me. I won't manipulate my way onto pulpits. I won't push my way through. If you don't open the door, then I will not go. If you open the doors for me, then I will walk through them and I will meet you on the other side. And that is exactly what happened. I went back to tell the priest that I would preach. Um, and prior to me telling him that, in that moment when I asked God for the covenant, those two things, it came almost immediately. The Spirit told me to call my godmother and to tell her what had happened to me. So I called her and she said, "Oh, that was God speaking to you, honey. Did you know that I graduated from seminary?" And I said, "No, I did not know that." And she said, "Oh, I can teach you everything you need to know about how to prepare a Sunday morning sermon." So I thought, oh, wow, right? And so she did. She mentored me uh, and taught me what books to buy and what questions she asked. And I kind of got a one-on-one sort of theological mentoring from this godmother. Anyway, so I go back and I tell the priest that I'm going to preach. And so I do. I preach my first sermon at this Black Catholic church. And then the next week, he comes to me and he says, I need to tell you something. I was meeting with some friends from Corpus Christi, and they told me that they were looking to hire a minister on their pastoral staff. And I told them I had the perfect person. And I said, well, who? And he said, you. And I said, oh no, Father Bob, I don't want to leave my church. I just preach for you. He said, I think that you have outgrown us. I think God wants to do more with you. And I gave them your number. If they call you, all I'm asking is that you go to the interview and let them interview you. If they don't hire you, then that's fine. You've done what I've asked. And so I did, and I got hired. To my surprise, I got hired to be the hospitality minister at Corpus Christi in 1992 because this priest saw gifts in me that I could not see in myself. Corpus Christi was life changing for me. It was a church that was standing up for the poor, for the marginalized, people living on the bottom rung of the social ladder. They were creating outreaches for the homeless, people with no health insurance. They were taking in people out of jail and prison. They were walking with them to create a new life for themselves. They were practicing shared male and female leadership, as well as lay and ordained leadership. This church was run like a family. And in fact, it was very similar to my family, where everybody was honored equally. And so when I arrived, I was hired on this staff, and I was the first African American full-time staff person on the staff. And what do I encounter in that role is racism in the church. And so I came back to talk to the staff and said, we have to do something. I know you're very inclusive of all these other groups, but racism is really a problem here. I had trouble getting some of the white coordinators to work with me. People were very uncooperative, uh, and it was a challenge. And so the church staff did. They partnered with me to address racism in the church. And so we began a racial justice program. We began to preach intentionally about racism. We began to have an annual film and discussions around racism. We collected stories of parishioners and we shared them. And we centered racism as part of the social gospel with everybody else. And I had about a 7-year run at Corpus until we were fired and the practices of inclusion shut down for being too inclusive of women and gay people and Protestants by offering communion to everybody. First, Father Jim was fired, then Reverend Mary, and then the six of us, which included myself. And I thought that was the end, and yet it was only the beginning of what God had in store for us. God was in the business of opening and closing doors. And thank God, eventually Reverend Mary was being asked to be the leader of a new community of folks. And she said yes to that. And so we were able to create a beautiful new church that emerged from the created, ashes that were created at Corpus Christi. And so for me, the lesson was to not misinterpret our struggle as failures or our struggles as the end of the story. That sometimes what appears as a failure to us is simply a bridge or a door to something better, something new. And so I learned to be patient and enjoy the journey ahead and keep walking and waiting to put my hand on the next door. And so in 2001, Reverend Mary became ordained a priest in the Old Catholic Church tradition, really showing and modeling for all women that it was possible to follow your call to the priesthood. And Reverend Mary led us in our community for 20 years, helping us to create a beautifully inclusive church that was still plagued with racism as much as it was sexism. And so in 2005, when we were a new church, Spiritus Christi, we got a special invitation by call to action. The invitation was for uh, myself to be willing to be trained in anti-racism so that I could join a national team of 40 people from around the country to form a national anti-racism team to help them as an organization become anti-racist. And so I said yes to that. We began training in 2005 for a year, and that training was then life changing. I realized that I could not do a training for an organization that was stationed in Chicago without also doing it in my own backyard. And so I decided to, what I was learning there, to come back and teach it at Spiritus Christi. We had a national anti-racism team, so I came back and I created a racial justice team at Spiritus, and we called it Spark. And we became committed. Justice call to action was to becoming an anti-racist church. And so we began a whole body of work with Spark. We provided annual trainings, anti-racism trainings for the community, the church community. We participated in protests against racist language and treatment of students that were happening in our community. We protested against shootings of unarmed Black people around the country and locally in our city. We hosted community conversations. We held book discussions. We integrated racism in our preaching. We advocated and organized for justice. We designed in 2017 a race convoy trip. Um, we adopted a Black community to lift and attend to via the Black Community Focus Fund, which was a non-for-profit we created. Um, and we took up the work to install a civil rights heritage site, partnering with other churches to come alongside Black Lives Matter as a justice movement. The 2017 Race Convoy was another life-changing and watershed moment. It was there that we took on an Easter week. We took 25 people of color and white people south to some historical places where racism had occurred and that were central to our racial history to become better ambassadors, really, to end racism. That's what we were looking to do. And so we went to sites in Cleveland where Tyree King, a 14-year-old, was gunned down by the police. We went to Tennessee, an international school where kids of color were, to take books to them where they could see themselves in it and engage the educators there. We went to um, uh, we went to Alabama, Selma and Birmingham and Montgomery, Alabama. We went to Cincinnati, and in those places, we saw lots of stuff. So Tyree King, the 14-year-old who was gunned down, he was killed because the police thought that he was part of a group of kids who robbed a white person of $10. So he lost his life over $10. Um, we went to jails. We spoke to people who worked in jails where people of color were treated inhumanely. Uh, with record shootings in Cleveland of unarmed Black men, we visited, as I said, the international school. We talked to imams at Muslim mosques. We went to the University of Alabama, where Authoring Lucy integrated the university around race under constant death threats. We visited the Birmingham Police Department. We went to the Civil Rights Museum. We went to the 16th Street Baptist Church, where 12-year-olds girls were bombed. The church was bombed and 12-year-old girls were killed and a fifth injured by a group of white men who were never charged. We visited a slave auction site where Black people were sold on the auction block. We visited where the Freedom Riders exited the bus and were beaten almost to a pulp. We visited a lynching museum. We visited an organization called the Equal Justice Initiative that fought for people who were wrongly convicted, many of them people of color, and placed on death row for race crimes, which usually involved white victims. And we visited a plantation. And each night we slept in a church and we unpacked those experiences that we had during the day. And we returned to Rochester inspired. And we felt called to excavate our own history, our local history, which has prompted our proposal to create our own first ever outdoor civil rights heritage park in Rochester, New York, to tell the story of the Black freedom struggle. And this past year, we finally we raised our first $1 million to begin to make that a reality. So we hope to start that project this spring and this summer. And we have a few million left to raise, but we're pretty confident that we will raise that. And there's just a lot of excitement. And the Black Community Focus Fund, non-for-profit that we've created, its goal really is to help get to zero on disparities that Black families and communities have experienced that have been connected to historical racism in education, in housing, and in economic opportunities. It was in that context, really, that the and this is kind of a picture of when we were at the Equal Justice Initiative. One of the projects they were doing is they had collected dirt um, uh, from 12 across 12 southern states where 4,000 Black people were lynched um, for really trivial reasons, and it eventually became an outdoor legacy museum by Brian Stevenson. So it was really in that context that George Floyd kind of hit us as a nation. And we were really, as a church, we were really ready because we had been steeped in this work around racial justice. And so we saw George Floyd killed on national TV. And then, as Frank was saying, then it happened in Rochester. Um, Daniel Prude, um, and I do have just a clip of this video. I don't know if it will, oh, it will do it. Okay. Um, I don't know if you're familiar with Daniel Prude's story, but I'm going to just stop sharing and then I'm going to share again because I think just this piece of the visual is really, share sound, is really important in terms of how disturbing this was for really for all of us who watched this. And this happened around March of 2020.
Hey, get on the ground.
So as you can see, kind of Daniel Prude is completely naked.
Get on the ground, man.
Get
on the
having
ground.
a mental health crisis.
Put your hands behind your back.
And
behind your back. Don't move. Don't move.
The officers
chill out, man. Don't move, all right, man? Just don't move.
They left him there. He's handcuffed. After they handcuffed him, he remains naked in the street. And he's talking out of his head. He's saying a lot of really crazy
Please
things.
let me get my money. Jump on the flight. Please. Jesus Christ. I pray.
Talking about getting on flights, praying to Jesus. He's going to get away from me. He's talking about peace.
Give me your gun, I need it. School crazy as hell. Give me your gun, I need it, man.
Talking about body parts, talking about guns,
I'm killing everybody in that house.
out of his head.
Jesus Christ,
And
I pray. Give me them handcuffs.
instead of calling for mental
Give
health,
me the man.
Your bare skin.
Give me
they just want to watch him and let him
Oh, my
there.
mama blood, they
They can
flipping over the
make
grave.
jokes about
I mean
him.
that.
And eventually they said
God
he's
bless
spitting,
y'all.
and so they
Let
put
me
a
up. Get the
spit hood on his head.
In Jesus Christ, I pray. Amen.
And they leave him there.
Christ.
Until at some point, the officers, they do what they call segmenting.
Give me the hand.
They grab him and they push his head down into the pavement.
Give me that gun. I mean it.
And eventually he loses consciousness. He starts to vomit. They don't check on him until that happens.
Calm down.
And by the time the ambulance arrives and he's transported to the hospital, he actually dies about a week later. He never comes out of the coma that he goes into. And then there's just a ton of cover up. Like they make him a victim, a suspect instead of a victim. And so it really sets off quite a protest throughout the city of Rochester, where the Black Lives Matter folks began to organize us as a community. And as you can see, thousands and thousands of us over time began to hit the streets calling for justice for Daniel Prude, and really calling for those officers to be fired, calling for transparency, and it didn't happen. Night after night, we hit the streets, and again, instead of the city recognizing that what happened to Daniel Prude really tapped into historical experiences of racism and degradation and inhumanity, what we found is that riot police would just line the streets and refuse to let us march to the public safety building to protest and to chant and to call for accountability for those officers. And in fact, what they ended up doing on this particular night in the fall of 2020 is, this is my church. We were protesting, and we were on our way. The police stopped us from going to the public safety building. And what they would do is they would declare that it is unlawful. They would just arbitrarily say, when you got to a certain point, get on the horn and say, you are this that your protest is unlawful. If you don't stop and turn around, you could be arrested. And then generally all hell would break loose. People would be arrested, people would refuse, because the crowd really understood that we had a constitutional right to protest. And this particular night, they stopped us from going to the public safety building. There were firecrackers being thrown. The police had sonic booms, and then they had police dogs, and they started spraying us with pepper bullets and rubber bullets and pepper balls, and it was absolute mayhem. And so the crowd started to leave to come back towards our church, because we actually had a medic team um, of healthcare professionals who were in the church and ready to attend to protesters if they were harmed. And there were several days where many protesters were harmed and they were arrested, and there were just lots of chaos. And on this particular night, the riot police pushed the protesters and bottlenecked them in front of our church, and they began to shoot at them. They began to shoot pepper balls and pepper spray and rubber bullets, and this was kind of one of the short stories.
Now, some demonstrators were hurt throughout all of this, and they tell us there was excessive use of tear gas and other. Now, some demonstrators were hurt throughout all of this, and they tell us there was excessive use of tear gas and other chemicals used by police, causing injuries.
So here's just a short.
A lot of eye injury specific.
This was
Now, some demonstrators were hurt throughout all of this, and they tell us there was excessive use of tear gas and other chemicals used by police, causing injuries.
There's a lot of eye injuries specifically because they're pointing their balls directly at people's faces. A lot of people have bruises, lacerations just from getting hit with rubber bullets.
Now, some of those who were hurt took cover inside the Spiritus Christi Church. We're told folks there were treating some of those individuals. As you can see here, demonstrators pointing out to us pepper ball blasts left marks on the side of that church building.
So there were about 100 protesters that night that were running from the police, and so we became sanctuary that night. We opened up our doors and we brought them in to the church to safety, and then I spent time all night on the phone with the mayor and with the police chief, demanding that they have their riot police stand down and get away from my church and to stop converging on these protesters. And it took us till about 2 in the morning to get the last protester out and to begin to have people feel like they were safe. So eventually the next morning, I called for a meeting with the mayor. Call for a meeting with the mayor to talk about what happened that night. And I was outraged, and I just said, this is wrong. When a community is grieving, the response is not to punish them for their grief, especially by a system that caused the grief in the first place. You have to let the community grieve. You have to allow the community to call for accountability. And so the mayor and I agreed that I asked her to take the riot police off of the streets, stop allowing them to block streets, stop allowing them to tell protesters that they can't walk up a street to protest, and then using that to do all of these random arrests and physical violence that was happening. She agreed, and so we talked about what else we could do. And the night before, on that Saturday night, actually, there were friends of mine who were part of Elders and Allies group, and they had a wonderful idea of asking 5 elders to be at the front of the line to kind of be involved and come alongside of the protesters. But the police didn't let us go through that street. 5 elders really was not enough. And so I talked to the mayor and said, what if I put 100 elders in the front line with the protests? We can come alongside of our own community. We don't need the police to monitor, to control us, and to inflict violence on the community. let us use this cultural model of elders to come alongside of a community that is grieving. She agreed, and she talked the police chief and his team into agreeing to allow us to live out this model more fully. And I was the point person that Sunday night for the protest. And it was the turn of the protest. It's the first time in the days and days of protesting that we had zero violence from the police or from protesters. Um, as elders, we just came alongside of them. And what you see here is after the meeting with the mayor, they invited me to their um, press conference. And at this press conference, I called for 100 elders to come forth. And we had 100 plus people from the community that just came from everywhere. And so we were able to show them that these nonviolent models work. And once you see them, you can't unsee them. Sorry, let's see. Oh, there we go. And then a few days later, the riot police showed up again. But this time, after we showed them these nonviolent models, what happened is that the protesters then took over and camped out at City Hall because they didn't feel like the mayor was listening to them. And so they took their protest to City Hall, calling for the officers to be fired who killed Daniel Prude, and calling for the mayor to step down, and calling for defunding of police budgets so that those monies could be used for folks who could attend to mental health crisis, could be used for attending to the poverty and the economic deprivation that leads to such high crime rates. And the city did not like that. So the police got called in because they said that the protesters were blocking the door for employees to go into the city of Rochester for work. But the truth is that the building has actually uh, three entrances. They were only in front of one of the entrances. There were two other entrances that employees could have absolutely gone through. But it became this stand down. So you had this whole slew of police who were converging on protesters. They were chasing them, they were arresting them. Some of the movement leaders were arrested, and it was really chaos. I happened to be at the church across the street having a meeting, and my phone started going off. The police were calling me, police chiefs were calling me, wanting me to come over and see if I could diffuse this. And the protesters were calling me to tell me what was going on. I get over there and then I find out for myself what is happening here. And after talking to the movement leader, I decide that I needed to stand with the protesters and not work with the police to shut them down because they wanted me to have them go away. And so in this picture here, that's kind of what you see. I walked up to the police who's in charge, the gentleman in charge, and I simply said, I want to be arrested. If you're going to arrest them, then you have to arrest me because they are not moving out of the streets, and neither am I. And they have every right to protest. It's their constitutional right to do that. So if you're here and you arrest people randomly, then you're going to have to arrest me too. And they decided to not do that. He was quite shocked and he said, wait a minute, Pastor Myra, wait a minute, I got to call the police chief. Can't we work this out? We don't want to arrest you. And so he called the police chief, and the police chief said, don't arrest her, work it out. And so there we are, working it out. And so we had this conversation. He said, well, can't you put him over on the side? And I said, well, I could do that, but aren't the sidewalks public sidewalks? Yes, they are. I said, well, then they have a right to protest on public sidewalks. He said, well, Pastor Meyer, but they're blocking the entrance for employees and employees need to get in. I said, well, they're no longer blocking those entrances. So employees can go into that entrance and they should be able to protest on the sidewalk. Well, Reverend Myra, but the city needs to come and clean up all of this mess, this tents and these things that they have here. And I said, I think we can do that too. I think we can do all three of those things. The city can come and clean, the protesters can go back on those sidewalks, and the employees can go through those doors. And he said, okay, Reverend Myra, I got to call the police chief and see if what we need to do here. So he made another phone call. Police chief said, do what she asks. He So we were able to get the police to back off. Um, the city came in and they cleaned up the area. Um, and I asked them once it was all clean if they would all just go away. And they did go away after it was all done. Um, and then I asked the city who was cleaning up to take their protesters' things and bring it to my church because their plan was to throw it all away. And I said, no, that's not right. Take it to the church across the street. And so we were able to stand with the protesters on that particular day. One of the things that I think about sort of transferable moments in our lives, and that we can use those moments to create the kind of change that we want, right? And so I thought about Spiritus Christi in Corpus Christi, right? That the journey that I had there with Corpus to Spiritus really was us creating a new design and a new blueprint of a church, right? We created a blueprint of inclusion without exception, following the radical teachings of Jesus as unconditional love. Through a new church, we were able to create this blueprint of shared male-female leadership, a blueprint of outreach to the community, a blueprint of self-governance by the people. And we added structural racism work to that blueprint in 2006. And I thought, if we can do that in the church, we can also do that in the world. And we really needed to do that for policing, because policing in Rochester was created, that system, in 1819 in New York State. New York State did not stop allowing slavery until 1827. And so the policing systems in most of our cities were constructed, and those blueprints were laid out without thinking about protection and public safety for people of color. That is not why what the thought was when those blueprints were created. Those blueprints were created to answer the question, what do we do with Black and brown bodies, and how do we protect white wealth and white anxiety? And so over time, we've tinkered with them, and we've done a little bit of reform here, a little bit of reform there, but people of color continue to get what the blueprint was designed to get them. This video that that went to this message here, was a video of 2013 event in Rochester where the police, the same policing system, tipped over a wheelchair of a disabled man who was at a bus stop. They were trying to clear a corner because they were, again, following the directives of business owners who didn't like the fact that there were too many Black people hanging around on their corner. And they assumed that if they were Black and hanging out, that everybody was selling drugs. And so they wanted the corner cleared. Well, it happened to be a disabled man in his 60s in his wheelchair. And they went to just discriminately tell everybody to get away, clear the corner. Well, he refused because he was at a bus stop. He's trying to catch the bus. And they continued to be aggressive with him. He swore at them, and they simply took that as an aggressive move. They tipped over his wheelchair and they began to beat him. They began to handcuff him. And so Rochester has had a slew of events like that with our policing system. And then this is kind of a group.
You need your hearing aids, I guess.
This was a group that protested that egregious act of Benny War. So these experiences really cause lots of trauma, physiological impact. It fuels community anger in communities of color, division, dehumanizes, upholds inequities that harm both people of color and white people. These injustices keep us from fulfilling Jesus's commitment to love our neighbor and to do justice. And we've been wrongly taught that loving our neighbor is just about forgiveness. It isn't. Loving our neighbor is equally about doing justice and addressing oppression and alleviating oppression. And so as Catholics, as a Catholic, I know that the Catholic legacy of resistance and racial justice is one to be drawn from. The Catholic involvement in the Southern Civil Rights Movement and racial justice movement was mixed, but it was present, right? Most Catholics preferred order and appearance of peace and stability over activism. Uh, for integration, and racial justice remained on the margins, but not for all Catholics. There were many nuns and priests who got involved in those moments, who risked their lives to be part of the resistance movement. And in the march from Selma to Montgomery for voting rights, again, Martin Luther King called for activism. And so there were Sisters of St. Joseph's, the Edmundite Order of Priests. So Catholics have been involved in these resistance movements. And so we have to, I think, during these tumultuous times, draw on that history for our own strength. So, how do we close the gap that divides us? I think we have to remember that it matters who gets to tell the story and what history we are starting from. I think it's important to commit to changing this policing blueprint, particularly for us in New York State. An 1819 blueprint will never give us justice. We are simply feeding a faulty blueprint. And I don't think we should be doing that. I think we have to not be afraid to interrogate power and unleash the voice of the powerless as we anticipate how we deliver justice. And then I think we must ask where all the harm lies, and not just where does harm lie from a position of power, because that's kind of what we're used to. We have people who hold power who tell us how afraid they are and how hard their jobs are, and then we slowly mute the voices of the powerless, and we hear them less and less. And really, those of us who hold power and who are in the privileged position, we are the ones who should take the longer walk. We should make lots of room for the powerless to speak and to guide us. So, what was next for us as a community? In the midst of that, we knew that we needed to deepen our racial knowledge and the knowledge of our community. So, we created a racial justice learning page. We provide ongoing learning for our parishioners and for our larger community. So that we can talk about racism from an informed place and not an opinionated place or an emotional place. And so we provide video, and we encourage books and documents and prayers. We created teach-in series for our staff and for our parish. We brought in speakers to talk to us that included activists and movement leaders at our Thursday night masses. We created Zoom offerings for discussion and parish forums. We started starting with the people's demand for justice for Daniel Prude. We wanted our church to understand why those demands were important, what they were asking for. We tried to destigmatize the word defund the police so we could break that down for folks and have real conversation about that. We gave interviews, we brokered meetings between the mayor's office and movement leaders and protesters. We provided racial justice training for our staff, for our visioning board. We continue to provide it for political leaders who are going to lead us through this. And we instituted organizational caucusing. So in our church, when we come across an impasse where around race, we send white people into caucus to unpack that. And we send people of color into caucus to unpack it, to deepen learning, to deepen reflection, and then to come back with a way forward to move. We've begun in our parish to take up structural work around race, looking at our policies and our practices, making sure that they're equitable, making sure they're racially just, changing the lens by which we interrogate organizational narratives that privilege those who are white while disadvantaging people of color. And I think what needs ongoing attention is to keep creating conversations with law enforcement officers and parishioners, which we have done. We continue to create conversations with business owners. I called for a conversation with system design folks to talk about how do we get from an 1819 policing blueprint to something much better, something that works for all of us. To create a volunteer list of how people can help in the movement for justice. I think organize, letter writing, book discussions, phone banks, protest opportunities, creating media teams, putting out your message, right? A justice team, prayers, and really advocacy, right? To meet with those who are decision makers. And, so I find that all of these things are really, really important in terms of our journey with racial justice. Like, I think of it as you have to throw the kitchen sink at it, right? Or it's not going anywhere. And it's going to take all of us because it really is important that we develop the will, to undo what our ancestors handed us. We are not responsible for what they created, but we are responsible for creating something better than what we have been handed. And that is, I think, what motivates me to do the work in our parish, to do the work of racial justice. Thomas Aquinas had a wonderful quote that said, truth spoken with love produces wisdom. And I think that is the method that we try to use in this work. But it requires courage to speak the truth, especially when we feel like the people who we're speaking it to could take something from us, that maybe they won't take our meetings anymore. Maybe they won't view us as good people anymore. But I think we have to be like John Lewis and be willing to get into good trouble, and I think together we can actually move the needle, right? But I keep telling myself every day, people created it, people can end it, right? This is not a Goliath. It isn't. Um, our ancestors, people like you and I, right, put this thing together. And people like you and I, if we develop the will and the racial knowledge and the racial stamina, we will end it. So,
thank you so much, Reverend Myra. We have a few moments left for some questions. If anyone would like to ask a question, you can unmute yourself. I love that sentiment. People created it, people can change it. It has to happen.
it has to happen. And we're seeing some of that. I mean, in our city, we're finally doing a basic annual income pilot, right, to see if we can't get rid of the poverty, the deprivation that poor people are living at. We have a by the block housing piece of legislation that is designed to address historical disparities and discrimination in housing for people of color in our city, where there were racial covenants, where there was redlining, where the city kind of stood by and let those things happen. Urban renewal policies that, broke into Black and brown communities and displaced them. And so we're starting to see some fruit, both of our work in the church and in our local community, where people are, they're continuing to push and say we have to address and redress these histories in meaningful ways.
Yeah, some might assume, Reverend Myra, that you pastor a quote unquote Black church. And I know Rochester is 40% African American, but can you share with us, generally what is the demographic of Spiritus Christi?
Yeah, so Spiritus Christi is probably about 87% white congregation, and the rest is people of color. And so, people assume that, oh, that's easy for you because you're a Black woman and, you're talking to Black people. I am not. I've had to really bring a large swath of the white community with me and being very intentional to unpack this history, very intentional into unpacking these stories, very intentional in teaching opportunities and learning opportunities and in conversational engagement and and just kind of saying, let's talk about it. Let's talk about it. We can do this.
It's great. I also read in one of your writings, and I think it's along the lines of what you stated, but you had written, if their system is the author of harm, their system has to be the author of healing. That was insightful.
Absolutely. I mean, I think we have to learn to be okay with accountability, right? We can't hide from accountability. If we become the author of harm, it is our responsibility to redress that and ask the question, how do I then participate to be the author of healing based on the harm that was caused, whether it was intentional harm or unintentional harm. It doesn't really matter, right? If we left an impact of harm, we have a responsibility to attend to that. We don't get to pretend that that didn't happen and leave that for somebody else.
I think, though, the distinction between accidental harm and intentional harm is pretty important.
I don't think it's important. And I'll tell you why. I'll tell you why, because whether it is intentional or accidental, the people who are on the other side of that impact are still harmed. It doesn't change anything because it was.
But it changes the prescription, right?
It doesn't.
A viral disease and a bacterial infection are both bad. They could both kill you, but you need different prescriptions for different illnesses, right? There are lots of doctors who will give somebody with a viral illness an antibiotic that's useless against a viral illness because it's a thing they can give them, and it'll make them feel like they did something. So I think analogously, like what makes an ism an ism? Catholicism, Buddhism, Taoism, capitalism, communism, socialism. In most cases, isms are defined as articulated systems that define how the world is supposed to work. So, I mean, all of those things, and they may not be the way the world does work, but it's the way it ought to work if you're, Buddhism or Catholicism or whatever. And for that matter, capitalism and socialism, right? So in that sense, there are aspects of racism that are isms in that sense, right? Ku Klux Klan, Nazism, all that kind of stuff is ism in that exact sense. It's an articulated system that's here's the way the world ought to work, and it's an evil system, but it's a system, right? And so I think that it's worthwhile to distinguish between ubiquitous discrimination, which is viruses can kill you as can bacteria, right? So it's not that it's any less, but it's a different thing. And so it requires a different prescription than Nazism or, the Ku Klux Klan or old school Jim Crow, where you had statutory racism. That's different from
Bill, can I ask you a question? Bill, can I ask you a question?
Yeah.
Can you tell me the last time a virus spoke to you, called you by your name?
No, viruses don't do that. Obviously, that's not.
Yeah, so that's the point, right? That's the point that I'm making. Let me help you with this. If you let me, I'll help you with this. You're taking an example about a virus that really is about a system where we're talking about people engaging in behaviors and actions that actually cause harm. We're not talking about a scientific or a biological virus. If we
no, I'm just saying it takes a different prescription. That's all.
I understand what you're saying.
Yeah.
And I'm trying to tell you that you're trying to mix apples with oranges. When we talk about whether or not it is intentional or unintentional, it does not matter when we're talking about racism. What matters is that we become aware of what the impact is, that we ask the people who have been harmed by that we become aware of how they've been harmed by that, and let them be part of helping us to get to the redress.
Oh, of course.
We don't get to decide that on our own, right?
Yeah, of course.
In an intellectual kind of way. We don't get to do that, right? And so it is impact that is important when we're talking about racial harm, not intention. It is, and we'd like to stay there because. But
the prescription is different, right? Because when the Freedom Riders were trying to make sure that the constitutional rights were observed, it was clear that there was a law in place that was not being observed. And so, or there were laws in place that were violating the Constitution, and those laws had to be changed. So the finish line, the destination was clear. Success was clear. Abolish white-only facilities in the South. So there was a clear finish line. But it's different now because it's not a matter of change. Now, and if you're talking about police behavior, that's quite different because there you can create laws to make police liable for what they do and fail to do. And we don't have that right now. Police can stand by and watch somebody get beat up or almost killed on a New York subway, and they're not, then that's perfectly okay because they don't have any obligation to help that person. There's all kinds of evil shit. But the thing is that there's a whole other class of racial discrimination that's not matters that you can legislate. It's matters that are changes of heart rather than changes of law. And so what the prescription
Bill, we have a 10 o'clock service that most people will probably want to dial into. I don't think we've talked about solutions here so much, and it's clear that there's a whole lot of education and dialogue and work that we could do in this area. I hope, if anything, that today's talk has kind of opened that box for us all, and maybe we at Manhattan Beach Community Church can begin to have a discussion around these topics and these issues, because clearly, I think the last 4 or 5 years have really opened my eyes to the fact that racism is really a thing in the United States. It's pretty obvious. And just trying to understand that there's so much packed into it.
Yeah, there's a lot in it. I appreciate that. I would say that I think the prescription is what the people who are impacted say that it is. And I would also say that I think we talk a lot about getting to the finish line. If we were at the finish line, we wouldn't still be dealing with racism today. So I don't think we're at a finish line. I think that we've made some progress. And then I think we've had a lot of retrenchments, which is why I think we need the will. We need to keep building the will and building racial knowledge and building racial stamina and cultural humility to really hear from the people who are being impacted what they need from us.
I had a quick question from Mary about, are there ways that we could actually participate in some of the training offerings that you provide?
Yes, we will be putting them up on our website soon. I'll be working actually with our tech people this week. We have an open training that's coming up in March that people will be able to sign up for, and it will be a hybrid. We just finished, and we do open trainings and then we do specific ones. So we just did a training for state and local politicians, and that was a kind of a closed group because we designed them based on kind of that identity group, right? And the work that they're going to be tasked with doing in order to be able to do their work through a racial justice lens. But yes, we try to offer at least twice a year public open trainings for folks that they can sign up for.
So if you'll share that page link with me, I'll make sure to distribute it to everyone and we can monitor that for future opportunities.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I'd be happy to do that.
So with that, I'd really like to thank Reverend Myra for spending this time. You're in our thoughts and prayers, and just a lot of gratitude here for your depth of sharing and your message and your courage in taking on this fight. Just really thank you.
Oh, you're welcome. Thank you for having me.
Thank you. Thank you.
You're welcome. Take care, everybody.